What if the home you return to after war no longer feels like home? What if the only family waiting is a loyal dog and a house with more secrets than memories? After 12 years, Michael Harris, a veteran scarred by war and silence, stepped back onto the soil of his hometown. By his side, Duke, the German shepherd who had followed him through every battle. But when Michael opened the door of his family's old house by the lake, he didn't just walk into memories. He stepped into a secret his father had hidden for decades. A secret that would shake a town and ignite a community long divided. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments and subscribe so you never miss stories of hope, loyalty, and second chances. The morning in Maple Hollow broke clear and soft. The sky brushed in pale gold, and a crisp autumn breeze stirred through the trees lining the narrow road that led from the railway station toward the lake. Fallen leaves, half green and half yellow, rustled beneath the weight of each step, and sunlight danced upon the calm surface of the water beyond the fields. Michael Harris stepped down from the train with a stiffness in his gait that betrayed more than the weight of his duffel bag. He was 46 years old, his hazel hair touched with streaks of gray that caught the sun like strands of silver. A thin beard, also flecked with gray, framed a face that seemed carved by hardship. Sharp cheekbones, weary eyes, and the faint lines of a man who had lived too long with shadows. His beige shirt was neatly buttoned, though worn from travel, and the brown shoes on his feet had carried him through too many uncertain days. He walked not with the confidence of a soldier on parade, but with the careful steps of a man mindful of the injury that had ended his service, a knee that still ached when the weather turned cold, a constant reminder of the desert sand and the shrapnel that had nearly claimed his life. Beside him trotted Duke, his German shepherd, a dog 7 years old, yet still strong, his black and brown coat sleek under the sun. Duke's ears stood tall, every movement alert, and his amber eyes scanned their surroundings with the vigilance of one trained to protect. On the battlefield, Duke had been more than a companion. He had been Michael's partner, his anchor in chaos, a creature whose loyalty had steadied him when human bonds seemed fragile. The scars of war clung not only to Michael, but also to this faithful animal, though Duke carried them silently, with the dignity of one who had seen much and judged little. Michael paused at the edge of the station platform, the air heavy with the scent of pine and damp soil. Before him stretched the familiar road toward Maple Hollow, his hometown. 12 years had passed since he had walked these paths. 12 years since he had last seen the lake gleam like a mirror under the autumn sun. The years away had not been kind. His father had died before he left for the second tour, his mother passing quietly one winter while he was still overseas. Letters had reached him on foreign soil, words inked in sorrow, each message carving new wounds he had no chance to grieve properly. The home that had once been filled with laughter and the clang of hammer on steel was now only a shell waiting for him by the lakeside. The thought hollowed him out, and for a moment he felt as if the trees themselves leaned closer, whispering of all that had been lost. He remembered his father's forge, the sparks rising like fireflies, the deep voice instructing him to strike steady, to measure twice before cutting. He remembered his mother's hands dusted with flour, waving him in for supper. He remembered running barefoot through the grass with his brother before tragedy had taken him too young, but all of them were gone now. Time had stolen them as surely as war had stolen his peace. He shifted the duffel on his shoulder, his knee protesting with a dull ache. Duke glanced up at him, ears twitching, sensing the heaviness in his master's heart. The dog pressed his head briefly against Michael's hand, warm fur against tired skin, as if reminding him that he was not entirely alone. Michael allowed himself a faint smile, a rare expression these days, and rested his palm on Duke's neck. "You and me, old boy," he murmured, voice low and rough. "That's all we've got left." The walk from the station took him through Maple Hollow's narrow main street, where wooden storefronts leaned under the weight of years. Many were shuttered, their paint peeling, but a few showed life. A baker arranging pies in the window, a farmer tipping his hat from a wagon of apples. People glanced at him, some curious, some hesitant. Michael had been away too long, his uniform gone, but the posture still visible in the set of his shoulders. A man marked by both service and absence. He offered polite nods, but kept moving, unwilling yet to answer questions he wasn't ready to hear. When he reached the rise overlooking the lake, his breath caught. There it was, the house of his childhood. A two-story timber structure weathered gray, its porch sagging slightly forward, ivy clutching at the siding as though holding it upright. Beyond it lay the forge, a small stone building with a rusted chimney, silent for more than a decade. The lake behind them shimmered, reflecting the gold of the trees, a beauty that only made the silence of the house more piercing. He climbed the porch steps slowly, each creak under his boots a memory. Here, his father had once sat on summer evenings, sharpening tools while telling stories of ancestors who had built with steel and sweat. Here, his mother had rocked in her chair, knitting by lantern light. He could almost hear them, voices rising in the quiet, but when he reached the door and laid his hand on the handle, there was only silence. Inside, dust hung in the beams of sunlight, streaming through cracked windows. The air smelled of wood, long closed to fresh breeze. Faded outlines on the walls marked where pictures had once hung, family portraits, a painting of wildflowers, an old clock his father wound nightly. Michael stood still, his heart tight, as if by standing he might summon them back. But only Duke's claws clicked softly on the floor, grounding him in the present. Loneliness pressed hard. He had faced firefights, ambushes, and nights in deserts where silence meant danger. Yet nothing felt as heavy as this emptiness. It was the weight of absence, the finality of knowing he could not knock on a door and hear his father's voice again. He lowered himself into a chair by the window, the wood groaning, and pressed his face into his hands. He wanted to weep, but found himself unable, his years in the army having trained him too well to hold back. Duke settled at his feet, eyes fixed on him, patient. In the dog's steady gaze, Michael felt a thread of comfort. War had taken much, death had taken more, but here was life still beside him, breathing, loyal. He reached down and scratched behind Duke's ears, drawing strength from the simple act. The dog's tail thumped once against the floorboards, a sound like a promise. Michael lifted his head, eyes drawn to the forge visible through the back window. The chimney stood against the sky like a monument. His father had said once that steel is not born strong, it is shaped strong. Michael whispered the words aloud, voice trembling. If he could forge iron from fire, maybe I can forge something new from this. He sat back, letting the sunlight fall across his face, warming him where grief had made him cold. For the first time since stepping off the train, he felt not only the ache of what was lost, but also a faint glimmer of what might still be possible. He and Duke had returned, scarred but breathing, and perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough to begin again. The next morning dawned with a veil of mist lifting slowly off the lake, the autumn sun stretching its golden arms across the surface like a painter brushing light onto canvas. Michael Harris stepped out onto the sagging porch, the boards creaking beneath his weight, his beige shirt tucked neatly, though its fabric bore the wear of time. He squinted against the morning light, inhaling the cool air tinged with the scent of damp leaves and faint smoke from a distant chimney. Beside him, Duke padded silently, the dog's sleek brown-black coat catching glimmers of gold as the sun rose higher. His amber eyes scanned the horizon, ears perked and ready. Though here there were no enemies, only the rustling of squirrels and the calls of unseen birds. Michael's gaze fell on the house itself, the place his parents had left him. Up close, the paint had long faded to a weathered gray. The shutters hung crooked, and ivy clung stubbornly to the walls. The roof sagged at one corner, and the porch railing leaned like a tired man. Yet, even in decay, the house stood proud, as though defying the years, a silent witness to lives once lived within. Behind it, the forge loomed, a squat stone building with a chimney that pierced the sky like a spear, though its mouth had not breathed fire in more than a decade. Michael pushed the door open again, entering with measured steps. Dust swirled in shafts of light that streamed through cracks in the shutters, illuminating the worn furniture and faded walls. He had started cleaning the night before, but so much remained. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and debris littered the kitchen, where his mother once baked bread. His heart tightened at the sight of a chipped mug on the counter, as if waiting for hands that would never return. He spent hours sweeping, stacking old chairs against the wall, wiping down frames whose pictures were long removed. The ache in his knee flared with every bend, but he forced himself on. At times he paused, running a hand along the wooden banister, polished smooth by decades of family hands. Each touch felt like a whisper from the past. By noon, Michael decided to tackle the forge. Duke trotted ahead, nails clicking against the stone path. The forge's heavy wooden door groaned as he shoved it open, a rush of musty air greeting him. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of rust and old ash. Shafts of sunlight pierced gaps in the roof, casting long beams across the dusty floor. The great anvil still sat at the center, its surface pitted with use, and tools hung crooked on the walls, most of them rusted. Michael set down his bag, breathing deeply, his chest tight. This was his father's domain, a place where sparks once danced like fireflies, where steel sang under hammer. He had not set foot inside since boyhood. For a long moment he stood still, memories washing over him, until a sudden bark from Duke snapped him from his reverie. The dog had nosed his way to the far corner, where the floor was uneven and boards warped. Duke scratched furiously, growling softly as if trying to draw attention. Michael frowned and stepped closer. The German shepherd pawed at a section of floor, his claws clattering against the wood. His amber eyes met Michael's as if urging him, "Here, look!" Michael knelt, his knee protesting sharply, and rapped his knuckles against the plank. The sound was not solid, but hollow, an echo that made his pulse quicken. He tapped again, and the hollowness resonated deeper. Sunlight shifted through a crack in the roof, spilling directly onto the spot where Duke scratched. There, faint beneath the dust, Michael saw a thin iron ring embedded in the wood, nearly hidden by grime. His breath caught. He wiped the ring clean with the cuff of his sleeve and tugged. The board resisted at first, as though reluctant to reveal its secret, then groaned as it lifted. Dust puffed into the air, and a dark opening yawned beneath. A narrow set of wooden steps descended into shadow. The smell that drifted up was of earth and iron, untouched for years. Michael hesitated, heart pounding, memories of his father stirring. He remembered being told as a child never to play in the forge after dark, his father's stern eyes holding secrets he never explained. Now he wondered if this was the reason. Duke whined softly, tail swishing, his body tense yet eager. Before stepping down, Michael fetched an old lantern from the wall. He wiped soot from the glass, found a half-melted candle within, and lit it with a match. The flame flickered uncertainly, casting a weak glow. With Duke at his side, he descended the creaking steps, each one groaning under his weight. The cellar beneath the forge stretched farther than he expected. Stone walls dripped with moisture, and the air was cool, carrying the scent of oil and iron. Along one wall stood shelves lined with carefully arranged boxes, their labels faded. Against another wall, covered with a tarp, was something bulky and square. Michael pulled the cover away, revealing a sturdy workbench and a set of tools unlike those upstairs. These were polished, oiled, and sharp, as if waiting for their craftsman to return. On the bench lay a thick, leather-bound book, its cover darkened with age but intact. Michael brushed off dust, revealing faint words etched into the leather. "For my son, when the time is right." His throat tightened. He placed a trembling hand on the book, but did not yet open it. His father's presence seemed to fill the room, the silence heavy with unspoken words. Duke padded around the cellar, sniffing at boxes filled with iron scraps, molds, and patterns. The dog sneezed once, then sat, ears forward, his gaze fixed on Michael, as if urging him onward. Michael's chest rose and fell with deep, uneven breaths. He thought of his father, a tall man with a square jaw, dark hair always dusted with ash, and hands scarred from years of shaping steel. His father had been stern but fair, a man who believed that work was a form of prayer. He had never spoken of secrets, but perhaps this hidden chamber was his final lesson. As Michael stood there, lantern light dancing across stone walls, he felt the weight of grief but also something new, a flicker of purpose. This was no ordinary cellar. It was a vault of legacy, a place his father had crafted to endure beyond death. And now it belonged to him. Michael closed his eyes briefly, whispering into the shadows, "What did you want me to find, Dad?" The words trembled into silence. When he opened his eyes again, he tightened his grip on the book. Whatever truth lay inside, He knew it was the beginning of something that would change not just his life, but perhaps the town that had forgotten him. He climbed back up, Duke close behind, the lantern casting their shadows tall against the forge walls. The afternoon sun greeted them as they emerged, golden and warm, as though the day itself acknowledged the secret now unearthed. Michael replaced the plank gently, dusting his hands. He looked toward the lake, its surface shimmering, and felt a whisper of determination. His father's forge was more than a ruin. It was a door, and Duke had just helped him open it. The afternoon sun slanted low across the lake as Michael eased the wooden plank aside, revealing the dark mouth of the hidden cellar once more. Dust drifted in thin veils through the shaft of light that pierced the gap, motes turning golden in the glow. Duke whined softly, his amber eyes fixed on the opening, his body poised with the same alertness he had carried on patrols in the desert. Michael tightened his grip on the old lantern he had lit earlier, its flame flickering as if nervous about descending into places long abandoned. His breath came slow, controlled, but within his chest his heart struck faster beats, echoing like the hammer he remembered from childhood. He stepped down cautiously, his injured knee protesting on the first rung of the ladder. The air grew cooler, the smell of earth, iron, and faint oil mingling into something oddly comforting, like stepping into the lungs of a forge that had held its breath for decades. Duke followed close, his claws tapping against wood, his muscular frame moving with a quiet grace. When they reached the stone floor, Michael lifted the lantern higher, its glow brushing the contours of a hidden world. The cellar was not a place of neglect. Yes, dust clung to corners and cobwebs stretched across beams, but beneath the years lay care, intention, and order. Along one wall, shelves bore boxes and jars meticulously labeled in his father's steady hand, though the ink had faded to brown. The air smelled faintly of cedar, as if someone had stored the place not to be forgotten, but to be preserved. On a long bench at the center sat tools, hammers of varying weights, chisels, and a pair of blacksmith's tongs, all gleaming faintly with the sheen of oil, as if recently tended. Michael's throat tightened. These were not relics discarded. They were instruments waiting. He approached the bench, lantern light quivering across the steel. A broad anvil stood near the wall, its surface clean of rust, as though someone had polished it before sealing the place. The edge bore no cracks, only the soft curves of long use, and on its horn was etched a small mark Michael remembered from his boyhood, the symbol of his father's initials, carved with pride into the steel itself. He ran his fingers across it, the cold surface biting against warm skin, and for a fleeting moment he felt his father's presence beside him. Then he saw it, the thick leather-bound book resting on the bench, its cover dark and sturdy. Dust lay upon it in a thin veil, but beneath, the leather still glowed faintly with oil. He brushed it off with his palm, and as the words revealed themselves, he froze. Steel is forged by fire, men are forged by community. The letters were pressed deep into the leather, his father's credo carved into permanence. Michael's knees weakened, and he lowered himself onto a stool, holding the book in both hands. The lantern flame trembled as he opened the cover. Inside were pages filled with diagrams, of tools, sketches of hinges and gates, and margins filled with notes in neat block letters. Some pages contained detailed methods, how to temper iron, how to control the color of heat to read its strength. But scattered between the technical notes were words that struck deeper, reflections on family, faith, and the meaning of labor. His father had not only written instructions for metal, he had left a philosophy of life. Michael read lines that made his breath catch. A man's strength is not the weight of his hammer, but the steadiness of his hand when helping another. Another page read, "Do not let work become only for coin. Shape your tools so they serve the people, and the people will remember you when the iron cools." He closed his eyes, overwhelmed. All these years, he had thought his father a man of few words, one who spoke only through the ring of steel on anvil. Yet here, in these pages, was a voice more eloquent than Michael had ever imagined, a man who had prepared his son not just to work, but to live with purpose. Duke patted close, nudging his knee, the warmth of the dog grounding him in the moment. Michael stroked the German shepherd's head absently, his mind racing. His father had not left him wealth, nor land, but something greater, a forge preserved in secret, tools ready for use, and words that bound iron to humanity. Michael rose slowly, carrying the lantern across the cellar. He uncovered more, a set of molds for plowshares, carefully arranged, a rack of hammers graduated from heavy to light, and, in the far corner, a chest with brass fittings. He knelt and lifted its lid. Inside lay smaller objects, hinges wrapped in cloth, a collection of nails, and a pair of handcrafted horseshoes polished to a shine. Each piece spoke of craftsmanship, patience, and care. As he studied these items, he felt the golden shafts of sunlight piercing through narrow vents above, striking the steel until it glowed faintly in the dim. Dust floated like spirits in the light, as though his father's hands lingered, watching. Michael whispered into the cellar air, his voice raw. "You didn't just leave me tools, Dad. You left me a way back." The weight of the war years pressed against him then. The firefights, the friends buried, the sleepless nights filled with screams only he could hear. PTSD had carved hollows in his mind, shadows that no therapy had fully dispelled. Yet here, in this quiet forge, he felt a stillness stronger than silence. He felt connection. To his father, to his town, to something larger than his pain. He placed the book carefully back on the bench, its leather cover gleaming faintly in lantern light. He tightened his grip on the handle, drew in a long breath, and turned to Duke. "Looks like we've got work to do," he said softly. The dog's ears perked, tail thumping once against stone. Michael extinguished the lantern and climbed back toward the sunlight, Duke close at his heels. As they emerged, the late afternoon sun poured through the forge's doorway, spilling gold across the floor. Michael stood there for a long while, the book heavy in his hands, the warmth of the sun mingling with the memory of his father's fire. He felt something stir within, a quiet resolve, like embers catching in the ashes of a long, cold hearth. For the first time in years, he did not feel alone in his struggle. He felt forged. The day had been long, filled with the weight of discovery. Michael Harris had spent hours seated by the forge, poring over his father's notes in the leather-bound book, his mind turning over not just the instructions on steel, but the philosophy that wove between the pages. By late afternoon, the air outside had cooled, and the sunlight fell across the lake in ribbons of gold. The quiet waters shimmered like a sheet of glass, reflecting maples aflame in the hues of amber and orange. A breeze carried the scent of pine and the faint smoke of someone's hearth in town, while cicadas sang the season's fading song. Michael walked the narrow path by the lakeside, Duke pacing at his side, the German shepherd's ears twitching at every bird call. For a moment, Michael allowed himself a rare sense of peace. His beige shirt was rolled at the sleeves, his brown shoes scuffed with dust from the path, and the faint beard along his jaw caught flecks of sunlight. He still bore the lines of a man who had known war, but here by the lake he felt lighter, as though the years might ease. Duke trotted happily, tail low but wagging, occasionally pausing to sniff the ground or splash in the shallow edge. Michael let him wander, his gaze drifting across the water, lost in memory of childhood swims with his brother when their father had whistled from the porch to call them in for supper. Then Duke froze. His ears shot upright, body stiff, eyes fixed on the lake. A sharp bark broke the quiet, followed by another, louder, urgent. Michael spun, scanning the water. At first, he saw only ripples, the golden surface fractured by breeze. Then, there, near the deeper stretch, a small head bobbing, arms flailing weakly. A child. Without thinking, Michael broke into a run. His knee screamed with pain, but adrenaline surged stronger. He tore off his shirt as he sprinted down the bank, Duke racing ahead, barking in frantic bursts. The boy's cries were faint, swallowed by the distance, but his thin arms beat against the water, sinking lower with every second. Michael plunged into the lake. The cold struck his body like steel, but he pushed through, his strokes uneven from the stiffness of his leg. Duke leapt beside him, the dog's muscular body cutting through the water with ease, his coat slicked to his frame. The shepherd swam wide, circling as if trained for rescue, his amber eyes locked on the boy. Michael powered forward, each kick burning in his knee, every pull of his arm dragging him closer. At last, his hand caught fabric, thin, soaked cotton clinging to a frail body. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, his dark hair plastered against his forehead. He couldn't have been older than 9. Michael gripped him under the arms, pulling him close, his own lungs aching for air. "I've got you," he rasped, though his chest heaved with effort. Duke swam in beside them, paddling steadily, guiding them toward shore. The dog barked once, a sharp sound, then pushed slightly against the boy's side, herding him like sheep toward safety. Together, man and dog fought through the cold waters until their feet touched bottom. Michael staggered, hauling the boy upward. They collapsed onto the grass at the bank, both gasping, water streaming from their bodies. Within moments, voices rose behind them. Townsfolk had seen from the road and were rushing down, their figures framed by the golden light of sunset. A woman led them, her apron still dusted with flour, her face pale with fear. She was Sarah Whitfield, a baker's wife known in Maple Hollow for her kindness and her steady presence in the community. Tall and slender, with ash-blonde hair tucked beneath a kerchief, and pale skin flushed by worry, she dropped to her knees beside the boy, tears in her eyes. "Eli!" she cried, pulling him into her arms. The boy coughed weakly, water spilling from his mouth, then clutched at her. His chest rose and fell with ragged breaths. But he was alive. Michael sat back heavily, pressing a hand to his aching knee, his body trembling with exhaustion. Duke stood nearby, dripping wet, shaking his coat and sending droplets into the cooling air. His ears twitched, but his gaze remained fixed on the boy, as if unwilling to leave until certain he was safe. Sarah looked up at Michael, her eyes brimming. "You saved him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "God bless you, both of you." She reached to touch Duke's wet fur, the dog accepting it with a low, contented rumble in his chest. More villagers gathered. Thomas Miller, the blacksmith's son with broad shoulders and soot-streaked skin, his square jaw set with gratitude. Margaret Evans, an elderly widow who always carried a kerchief in her hand, her thin frame stooped but her spirit unbowed, and others, their faces lit with awe and relief. They clustered around, murmuring thanks, some patting Michael's shoulder, others crouching to stroke Duke's ears. Michael, unaccustomed to such attention, lowered his gaze. His life since the war had been one of shadows and solitude. Yet here, beneath the autumn sky streaked with fire, he felt the warmth of something he had thought lost. Connection. The boy, Eli, looked at him with wide brown eyes. His cheeks were still pale, but a hint of color returned. He whispered hoarsely, "Thank you, sir." Michael managed a faint smile, though his chest ached. "You're safe now?" he replied, voice rough but gentle. As the sun dipped lower, the scene seemed touched by grace, the lake glowing in molten gold, the townsfolk gathered with tears and smiles, the boy wrapped in his mother's embrace, and Duke sitting proudly at Michael's side. It was as if the entire community had been bound together by that moment. From that evening on, whispers spread through Maple Hollow. The veteran and his dog, who had once been strangers, were no longer outsiders. They were spoken of with respect, with gratitude. The house by the lake no longer belonged to ghosts alone. It now belonged to a man in his K9 who had given the town back its faith in courage and loyalty. The morning after the rescue by the lake carried a different air across Maple Hollow. Word had traveled swiftly through the narrow streets and weathered porches, from the bakery to the church steps, that Michael Harris, the veteran once considered a stranger, had risked his life to save a boy. By dawn, neighbors began to drift toward the house by the lake, drawn by gratitude, by curiosity, and perhaps by the memory of the man who had once lived there, Michael's father, the blacksmith who had forged not only steel, but trust in the community. Michael stood on the porch, the beige shirt he wore damp with early dew, his hazel hair touched by a pale sun. He still bore the exhaustion of the day before, his knee aching from the strain of the water's fight. But he stood straighter than he had in years. Duke sat beside him, his brown-black coat gleaming where the sun struck it, his amber eyes bright, his ears twitching at every approaching step. The first to arrive was Sarah Whitfield, her tall frame wrapped in a shawl, her ash-blonde hair pinned neatly beneath a kerchief. She carried a basket, the scent of fresh bread rising from beneath a cloth. Her boy Eli clung to her hand, his cheeks still pale but his brown eyes alight with life. Sarah's face, long and narrow, softened as she set the basket on the porch rail. "The town owes you?" she said simply, her voice low but firm. "And this is just a small piece of thanks." Eli whispered a shy, "Thank you," before ducking behind his mother's skirt. Soon after came Thomas Miller, the blacksmith's son, his broad shoulders filling the porch as he stepped up. His face was square, with soot still smudged into the creases of his weather-roughened skin, his black hair cropped close. Thomas had once been known for a fiery temper, especially after his younger brother died in a mill accident, leaving him with a hardness that showed in his furrowed brow. Yet when he extended a hand to Michael, his grip was steady, his gray eyes softened with respect. "Your father's forge was the heart of this town," he said. "When I was a boy, he fixed my father's plow. Strongest blade we ever had." Behind him shuffled an old man, bent with age but with eyes still sharp as iron. His name was Henry Cole, once the village carpenter, now a widower who spent his days carving small toys for grandchildren who visited in summers. His thin frame moved with careful steps, his hands gnarled but sure as he leaned on a cane. His beard, long and white, framed a face furrowed by years but brightened by memory. He nodded at Michael. "Your father, Jonathan Harris, made the hinges on my workshop door," he recalled, his voice thin but unwavering. 40 years have passed, and they still swing smooth. He had hands blessed by God. Others followed. Margaret Evans, the elderly widow, brought apples polished red as autumn. A young girl named Clara Davis, no more than 12, shyly held out a jar of honey from her family's hives. And even Pastor Green, a stout man with thinning brown hair and kindly blue eyes, stopped by with words of blessing, his hand heavy on Michael's shoulder as he offered a prayer for strength. Each gift was small, but each gesture pressed on Michael's heart until he felt a weight heavier than any duffel: gratitude. Inside, the forge sat silent, as though listening. Michael stood at its doorway, Duke at his heel, watching the way sunlight filtered through the gaps in the roof, landing across the anvil. The leather book his father had left lay open on the workbench, its words echoing in his mind. "Steel is forged by fire, men are forged by community." Michael glanced at the neighbors who now lingered outside, their eyes full of expectation, memory, and hope. The decision rose in him with the inevitability of dawn. He set the book aside and rolled up his sleeves. Duke wagged his tail once, as if sensing what was to come. Michael stacked dry wood and kindling into the old forge, the stones blackened from years of silence. With a match, he coaxed a flame to life. At first it sputtered, shy, as if reluctant to disturb the stillness. But then, fed with air and wood, it caught, rising in a breath of heat that made his skin prickle. The townsfolk pressed closer, murmurs rippling through them as the first tongues of flame curled upward. Sarah held Eli tighter. Thomas folded his arms, eyes reflecting the orange glow. Henry Cole leaned on his cane, a faint smile crossing his lined face. Michael fed coal into the growing blaze, the crackle rising into a roar. Sparks leapt like fireflies, dancing into the air, catching briefly in the shafts of autumn sunlight streaming through the high windows. Sweat formed on Michael's brow, running down the lines of his sun-browned skin, dripping into his beard. He gripped the bellows, pumping life into the flame until it roared, red and gold, like a heartbeat revived. Duke barked once, sharp and triumphant, startling laughter from the children who had gathered near the doorway. Michael's chest swelled with something deeper than pride, something like resurrection. He lifted a hammer, its weight familiar in his hand though it had been years. He placed a bar of iron into the coals, waited until it glowed bright, then pulled it free and laid it across the anvil. The clang of steel against steel rang out, sharp and resonant, filling the forge like a bell calling a congregation. Each strike was steady, deliberate. The neighbors watched in silence, their faces lit by fire and memory. For them, the sound was more than noise. It was heritage returning. It was promise. For Michael, each blow was a release, of grief long held, of ghosts unspoken, of silence carried since the war. His arms burned, sweat poured down his temples, but his heart steadied. By the time he quenched the glowing iron in water, steam rising with a hiss, the forge no longer seemed abandoned. It pulsed with life. the faces watching. Him were no longer those of strangers, but of kin bound by something greater than blood. As the flames flickered against the stones, Michael stood straighter, the hammer resting loosely in his hand. He looked toward the crowd, his eyes meeting theirs, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself a smile. The forge was alive again, and with it, so was he. The forge no longer smelled of dust and abandonment. It breathed again, its stones warm with the memory of flame. Michael Harris stood before the anvil, with the leather-bound book of his father, open on a side bench. His hazel hair, streaked with gray, clung damp to his forehead, and the thin silver-threaded beard along his jaw glistened with sweat. He wore a plain linen shirt rolled at the sleeves, brown trousers faded at the knees, and scuffed boots blackened by soot. In his hands was a hammer heavier than comfort, and in his chest a nervousness that made his first strikes uneven. The iron bar glowed orange from the coals. Michael placed it on the anvil, raised the hammer, and brought it down. The sound was sharp but clumsy, the rhythm uncertain. Sparks spat outward, golden against the shadows. He adjusted, struck again, the blow crooked, and cursed under his breath. His injured knee throbbed as he braced, but he gritted his teeth, finding steadiness through pain. At the doorway, Duke sat tall, his brown-black coat shining with flecks of soot that drifted, his amber eyes fixed on Michael with an intensity that seemed like encouragement. Every time Michael faltered, the shepherd gave a soft whine, tail sweeping against the stone floor as if to say, "Keep going." By mid-morning, the sound of steel had carried across the lake. Neighbors who had come the day before began drifting back, curiosity drawing them. The first was Thomas Miller, the blacksmith's son, his broad shoulders filling the frame of the doorway. His square jaw was darkened with stubble, his gray eyes steady as he crossed his thick arms. "Not bad for a first strike in years," he called. "You'll get the rhythm. My father used to say steel will forgive mistakes, so long as the fire is right." Behind him came Clara Davis, the 12-year-old girl with chestnut hair braided loosely, her cheeks freckled and round. She carried a basket of pears and set it on a stool, her shy smile peeking through as Duke sniffed her hand. Clara giggled, whispering that he was braver than the boys in her school. Margaret Evans, the elderly widow with her bent frame, arrived next, leaning on a cane and bringing with her a scythe blade dulled by decades. "If you can sharpen this," she said in her thin, quavering voice, "I'll know your father's hands live on in yours." Michael accepted it with reverence, laying the blade on the bench. He recalled his father's notes about tempering edges, about patience in the heating. He set the scythe into the fire, watching as it grew red, then withdrew it, laying it on the anvil. His first strokes rang awkward, but slowly, guided by memory and instinct, he found a rhythm. The hammer sang a clearer note. The sparks leapt higher. By noon, the forge bustled. Henry Cole, the old carpenter with a long white beard, shuffled in, carrying a broken hinge. His voice cracked but warm. "Thought you might test your hands on something that still remembers my—" Shop Pastor Green stopped by again, wiping sweat from his broad forehead, his blue eyes shining as he murmured blessings over the work. Even Sarah Whitfield returned with Eli, the boy holding tightly to his mother's hand, his small face filled with awe as he watched the fire flare. Sarah's ash-blonde hair glowed in the light, her tall frame straight, despite the fatigue in her pale features. She placed her hand on Eli's shoulder, her expression a blend of pride and gratitude as she whispered, "Stay close, but watch. This is what courage looks like." The forge became a place of gathering. Boys leaned against the doorway, fascinated by the fire. Girls whispered and pointed when sparks burst like tiny fireworks. Older men nodded approval, recalling how Jonathan Harris's forge had once supplied the town with tools that lasted a lifetime. Michael, though drenched in sweat and straining against the ache in his knee, felt something stir in him stronger than exhaustion. Belonging. One by one, neighbors placed broken tools in his hands. Hoes with cracked heads, plowshares bent by stones, axes dulled by time. Each became his challenge, each strike of his hammer a conversation with the past and a promise for the future. He flipped pages in his father's book between heats, studying notes about balance and angle, then returned to the anvil to test them. Duke never left his post at the doorway, his ears swiveling toward the laughter of children, his gaze always returning to Michael as if anchoring him. As dusk fell, the forge glowed like a heart. The golden light of the autumn evening streamed through the windows, merging with the orange flare of the fire until it seemed the whole place pulsed with life. Children clapped when sparks shot into the air, their laughter ringing against the walls. Margaret Evans tested her newly sharpened scythe, her wrinkled mouth curling into a rare smile. Thomas Miller, arms crossed, gave a nod of respect he did not offer lightly. Sarah lingered, her gaze thoughtful as she watched her son slip closer to Duke, who allowed the boy to rest his small hand on his back. Michael set down his hammer at last, chest heaving, arms trembling, sweat running into the corners of his beard. He looked around at the crowd, their faces lit with fire and fellowship, and felt a warmth deeper than flame. He realized then that the forge was not merely for steel. The fire burned not just to temper iron, but to bind hearts, to stitch a frayed town back together. The clang of his hammer was more than work. It was invitation, it was prayer. And as he stood beneath the glow of fire and sunlight, Michael Harris understood the truth of his father's words. Steel is forged by fire, but men are forged by community. News spread beyond Maple Hollow like ripples across the lake. What began with a few repaired tools and sharpened blades grew into something greater, drawing people from nearby farms, crossroads, and even distant hills. By the end of the week, Michael's forge no longer stood silent except during nightfall. It roared each day, alive with fire, laughter, and the clang of steel. Michael Harris, his hazel hair darkened by soot and his thin silver-threaded beard matted with sweat, stood at the anvil with sleeves rolled high. His beige shirt had grown frayed at the cuffs, his brown boots blackened by ash, but his posture was steadier than it had been since returning from war. The rhythm of the hammer rang sure now, no longer uncertain as it had been at first. Duke, his 7-year-old German shepherd, remained the sentinel of the forge, ears perked, amber eyes gleaming, his muscular frame coiled with energy as he dashed out to chase birds and swirling golden leaves before circling back to sit at the doorway like a statue carved of loyalty. Villagers brought iron scraps and broken hinges, old chains and discarded plowheads. Michael worked tirelessly, but he no longer worked alone. Young men came to learn. One of the first was Samuel Carter, a lanky 19-year-old with tousled sandy hair and earnest green eyes. His jawline was still soft with youth, but his hands bore calluses from farm work. Samuel had lost his father to illness and carried a hunger to be useful, to craft something that would outlast him. He stumbled at first, striking iron too hard or too weak, but Michael's calm voice and Duke's watchful gaze steadied him. Another learner was Peter Lane, 23, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, his face sharp and defined, a scar cut across his left eyebrow, a remnant of a fall from a logging accident years earlier. That near death had left him quieter than most men his age, contemplative, but he possessed a strong arm and patience. He respected Michael quickly, asking few questions but repeating each movement with precision until sparks flew correctly. The yard around the forge transformed. Elderly men gathered on benches to tell stories, their voices weaving threads of history as children darted about, playing tag through piles of autumn leaves. Henry Cole, the old carpenter with his long white beard, came nearly every afternoon, carving small wooden toys as he told tales of Maple Hollow's early days. Clara Davis, the 12-year-old girl with chestnut braids, helped sweep the forge floor, humming as she worked, sneaking glances at Duke, who tolerated her with patient dignity. One afternoon, Sarah Whitfield came carrying jars of soup and loaves of bread. Her tall, slender frame moved gracefully, despite her weariness from years of raising Eli alone. Her ash-blonde hair caught glimmers of the sun, and her pale face softened as she watched her son, his brown eyes bright as he played with Duke in the yard. Eli ran, arms outstretched, pretending to be a soldier while Duke bounded after him, the boy's laughter carrying like bells. For Sarah, who had long carried grief after losing her husband in a farm accident, these sounds were both a balm and a reminder of hope. Michael hung a small wooden sign at the front of the forge, hand-carved letters etched with steady hands. Harris and Duke Forge, fire for the people. He hammered it into place while Duke barked once as if to approve. The words drew murmurs from villagers. Some chuckled at the idea of naming a dog as partner, but others nodded with respect, knowing well that the shepherd was as much a part of every victory as Michael himself. Soon projects for the community emerged. Pastor Green brought worn iron gates from the churchyard, their hinges rusted and frames sagging. With Samuel's eager assistance and Peter's quiet strength, Michael reforged them, hammering until they gleamed, strong enough to last another generation. Parents asked if he could craft a sturdy fence for the schoolyard so children could play safely. Margaret Evans, the elderly widow, requested a latch for her crumbling shed. Each request became part of something larger, and with each piece forged, trust deepened. Evenings at the forge became gatherings. The orange glow of fire spilled onto the yard, where neighbors lingered. Sarah often stayed, her tall frame casting long shadows in the firelight as she listened to Michael recount fragments of his father's lessons. Though she rarely spoke, her quiet presence steadied the atmosphere, a gentle anchor to the chatter of youth and the laughter of children. Michael, though weary from long hours, felt his chest lift each time the hammer rang. The fire burned not just iron, but loneliness, and with each spark he saw faces light, burdens ease, a town knit closer. Sometimes, when the forge grew too loud, he would glance at Duke sitting poised and regal, ears forward, eyes on him, as if reminding him that even in fire, loyalty anchored all. The lake reflected golden light at dusk, and under its glow, the once abandoned house now pulsed with life. Where silence once dwelled, now the yard held the hum of voices, the clang of iron, and the laughter of children chasing Duke through falling leaves. The community, once scattered, gathered again, not just around a forge, but around one man and his faithful dog, carrying forward the legacy of fire and belonging. Autumn returned to Maple Hollow, with its golden crown of leaves, the air crisp and laced with the scent of cider and wood smoke. A year had passed since Michael Harris struck the first uncertain blows in his father's long, silent forge, and now the old house by the lake no longer stood in silence but glowed as the heart of the town. The Harvest Festival was in full bloom, and for the first time in decades, it centered not in the church square, but here, around the forge where fire, laughter, and memory met. Michael stood before the anvil, his hazel hair flecked with more gray, his thin silver beard longer now, and his broad shoulders hardened again by a year of work. His beige shirt, patched at the elbows, was dark with soot, and his brown boots carried the marks of countless days at the forge. The ache in his knee remained, but he wore it differently now, not as a burden, but as a reminder that even broken things could serve. By his side, Duke lay stretched across the warm stone floor, his once vibrant muzzle now frosted with white. At 8 years old, the shepherd carried age in his coat, but not in his eyes, amber still fierce, watchful, and proud. The forge roared, flames leaping in rhythm with the ringing of the hammer. Children gathered near the doorway, their laughter spilling like bells as sparks burst into the air. Samuel Carter, no longer the uncertain boy of last year, but a confident apprentice with stronger arms and steadier hands, worked the bellows, his sandy hair damp with sweat. Peter Lane, silent as always, shaped hinges at the side bench with precision, his scarred brow furrowed in concentration. Both young men had grown into their roles, finding identity not just in steel, but in the community it served. Henry Cole, the old carpenter with his white beard, sat on a bench carving toy soldiers for the children. His thin frame bent with age, yet his eyes gleamed as he watched the fire reflect on eager faces. Beside him, Margaret Evans clutched a wool shawl around her narrow shoulders, smiling as she spoke of her youth, recalling when Jonathan Harris, Michael's father, had forged her family's first tools. Pastor Green led a prayer before the forge, his round frame steady, his thinning brown hair damp with heat, his voice rising in gratitude for the hands that built both steel and fellowship. Sarah Whitfield arrived with Eli, her tall frame still graceful, though the years had etched faint lines around her eyes. Her ash-blonde hair caught glimmers of firelight as she handed out apple pies and soup to the crowd. Eli, now taller, his brown eyes bright with health, darted to Duke and threw his arms around the shepherd's neck. Duke allowed it with patient dignity, tail wagging slow and steady. Sarah's gaze softened on the scene before her. the weariness of widowhood eased by a sense that the town had grown into family. The festival buzzed with life. Tables lined with bread, cider, and roasted chestnuts filled the yard. Children ran chasing Duke, their laughter tangling with the sound of hammer and bellows. Men and women marveled at the gates Michael had reforged for the church, the strong fences around the schoolyard, and the tools that now tilled their fields. Everywhere, evidence of the forge's renewal glimmered, not just in steel, but in the way people stood closer, spoke kinder, worked together. As the sun sank lower, painting the lake in molten gold, Michael set down his hammer. He wiped his brow and reached for the leather-bound book that had guided him, its pages worn, the words of his father etched deep in his mind. He placed his hand on the cover, the same hand that once saluted comrades, that once trembled with grief, now steady. In a low voice he whispered, "Father, I've kept the flame, not just for me, but for all of them." The crowd hushed as he spoke. The fire cracked in the silence, sparks drifting upward like prayers. Michael looked around him, at Samuel and Peter shaping futures with their own hands, at Henry and Margaret carrying memories forward, at Sarah and Eli with hope bright in their eyes, at Pastor Green bowing his head in blessing. At his feet lay Duke, chest rising slow but steady, eyes bright as embers even as age touched his frame. The house, once abandoned, now radiated light. The forge, once silent, now sang. The people, once scattered, now stood as one. The festival ended not with fireworks or music, but with the shared warmth of belonging, with the knowledge that fire could temper not only steel, but the hardest of hearts. As the last rays of sunlight met the glow of the forge, Michael looked toward the sky and felt something more enduring than flame. Promise. A promise that the fire of memory could forge hope again, even in hearts that had grown cold. And as Duke pressed his head against Michael's leg, tail brushing the floor, the veteran smiled through the sting of tears. The story of father and son, of man and dog, of steel and community, had become one. In the end, Michael's journey was never only about steel, fire, or even the echoes of his father's forge. It was about discovering that even the most broken places can be renewed when people stand together. The house by the lake became more than wood and stone. It became a living testament that community, loyalty, and love can turn silence into song again. And Duke, with his amber eyes and steadfast heart, reminded everyone that sometimes the greatest miracles arrive not in thunder, but in quiet faithfulness. Perhaps that is God's way of working in our lives, through simple sparks of kindness, the loyalty of a friend, or the courage to keep walking forward when the night feels long. As Michael learned, we are all shaped not just by fire, but by the hands of those around us. If this story touched your heart, take a moment today to thank God for the quiet miracles in your own life. Share this video with someone who needs hope. Drop a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe, so together we can keep the flame of faith, loyalty, and community burning bright. May God bless you and your family always.